Hey, good morning, everyone. I am Joe Rizzo with the Loudoun Museum, and this is our next edition of Pour Over History. And this morning we are joined by Maureen Connors Santelli, an associate professor at Northern Virginia Community College. And she recently had a new book that just came out called The Greek Fire. And that's what we're going to be talking a bit about today and how it connects with the Loudoun Museum's most recent exhibit. But Maureen, thanks so much for joining us for this Pour Over History interview.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
And as everyone knows who's watched this before, the theme is this is about the length of a cup of coffee in an interview, where we can get into some major topics with various authors and historians. So I've got my coffee from King Street Coffee downtown. Maureen, I'm guessing you got your Diet Coke?
Diet Pepsi.
Pepsi.
And actually, it should be Diet Dr. Pepper, but I ran out.
Well, we're mixing it up. Anything goes on Pour Over History.
COVID shortage for some reason.
And so, Maureen, last week the museum reopened with a new exhibit looking at this period that we call the Fragile Republic with the title, but looking at the period between 1800 and 1825 or so. A really important period that sometimes gets glossed over between the Revolution and the Civil War, but a time in which you're getting Americans really start to look internally about American potential democracy, or at least republic, but then other republics throughout the world. And when I was looking through your book, I mean, I think such a fascinating aspect about how Americans are viewing this revolution taking place in Greece during this era where there's also that self-questioning about the meaning of the American Revolution. So just to kind of get started, can you explain a bit for those watching about the origins of the Greek War for Independence?
Yeah, so the Age of Revolutions is the period that my book begins. And it describes the moment in the late 18th and early 19th centuries where we start to see a wave of revolutions inspired by Enlightenment principles such as individual liberty and Republican rule. The American and French revolutions proved that these ideas of independence were obtainable goals rather than mere utopian ideals. So we have many new nation states throughout the 19th century. They're going to emerge under this inspiration. The ideals of the Greek Revolution were put into motion by Greek intellectuals and merchants who were largely educated in Europe, France especially. We see important Greek intellectuals such as Adamantios Korais in places like France, Paris in particular, speaking with people like Thomas Jefferson on the subject of Greek identity and the possibility of overthrowing Ottoman rule in Greece. The American and French revolutions and the ideals of nationalism further gave strength to the possibility of these arguments in Greece. And nationalism has a little bit of a different meaning in our current moment than it meant in the 19th century. It's more about this idea that you have a group of people that have a common, identity traits like maybe culture, language, religion, what have you. And it's this idea that as a group of people, we should have a nation state, that we have this common identity and we should have self-determination. So the idea is that the Greeks have this shared history, language, religion, Christianity, of course, further solidified a desire for independence. So to cease being subjects of the Turks and instead be Hellenes, Greek citizens. The Philiki Eteria is this secret society that was made up of Greek elites, merchants, that supported the idea of Greek nationhood and professed these Enlightenment principles and nationalistic principles. So their efforts will ultimately set the course for the start of the revolution in Greece. While there was a global support for the ideals of the Enlightenment and the application thereof in the Age of Revolutions, the Greek War for Independence seems to especially fulfill these ideas because of their link with ancient Greece, and that the United States, Britain, Germany, France, etc., identified with that heritage. So the United States is going to support the Greek Revolution from that understanding, but there is also this international Philhellenic movement that is interested in supporting Greek independence.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. I mean, when you look at what people are saying during the revolution and in the early 1800s, they're always going and harkening back to ancient Greece. but this is an issue taking place right now that people are reading about in the news and trying to figure out how they then view not ancient Greece, but really Greece going through this revolution. How was the public opinion within the United States towards the revolution? And was that different than the kind of official stance then by the US government?
Yeah, so Greece just had it's the start of their 200th anniversary of independence, officially began on March 25th. So news about the Greek Revolution first makes its way into the United States in the spring of 1821. And almost immediately we see speeches being printed in newspapers. I'm especially interested in like popular opinion on the Greek Revolution, so I focus on those sources. There is this sort of romantic interest in supporting the Greeks. So initially it's really just sort of literary, inspired by Lord Byron, the great romantic poet who visited Greece and wrote a famous epic poem about his travels in Greece. So it starts off in a romantic sort of way, but as time goes on, by the time we get to the December of 1823, we have had various localities mobilizing to raise funds. At that point, it's really just they're raising funds and sending it to the Philhellenic group in London. So we get to December of 1823, where everybody is expecting that the Monroe administration is going to support Greece. So while, I mean, there's been this interest in supporting revolutions, but the United States hasn't really come out and done that officially. Everyone is expecting that we're going to do it this time. We're going to support Greece. Monroe gives his State of the Union address at the beginning of December. This is actually the famous speech that includes the Monroe Doctrine. And when you look at the speech, he sets out those tenets for the Monroe Doctrine, but he also couches it in terms of the Greek Revolution. And he says, ultimately, we're not going to support the Greek Revolution. We're not going to interject ourselves into European affairs. And he specifically makes reference to the Greek Revolution. People are shocked that, wait a minute, what? We're not going to support the Greeks? Because the United States, in developing a national identity at this point, very much had couched it in terms of a classical identity. And that goes back to the late 18th century, where Americans are distancing themselves from their Britishness. So they've embraced this classical historical narrative. And it's after Monroe's speech, we really start to see a national outcry for sending funds. This is where we see a lot of these Greek societies emerging, mobilizing to raise, tens of thousands of dollars. This was not just like a little blip where they raised $50. This goes on throughout the 1820s with interest from a range of groups throughout the country. I read, a range of sources where you have, of course, elites organizing talks, but you also have barbers pledging to donate their earnings from a particular day. The Washington Hose Brigade donated a pretty good amount of money to the Greek cause. So it's wide ranging across social statuses.
Yeah, that's interesting. Almost kind of have a groundswell of financial support to make up for the government, as I guess people seen as not really doing enough. Was there any, sometimes during times like this, you see people even willing to go over to fight. Are there any Americans that took part in any of the action over there?
Yes. So most famously, you have Samuel Gridley Howe, who becomes this important philanthropist of the 19th century. Eventually ends. He's trained as a doctor. He actually just had graduated from medical school. He's from a prominent Boston family, and he sort of does this thing with his family, like, oh, I want to go get battlefield training, so that's why I want to go serve in the Greek army. But in reality, he's this Philhellene at heart, and he wants to go off as this young guy to serve in the Greek army. He is going to take with him his knowledge of the Greek Revolution. It seems to have deeply influenced his sense about the abolitionist movement later, which I talk a little bit about in the book. So Samuel Gridley Howe's the big one, but there are others. Jonathan Peckham Miller, for example, is someone who actually serves almost like an unofficial agent for these, well, I was going to say the United States, but again, the United States never officially supports the Greek Revolution. So he's kind of serving as an agent for these Philhellenic societies and goes back and forth with money to Greece. But there are others. William Lloyd Garrison had this idea that he wanted to go off into the Greek army. He doesn't do that, but his early speeches in the late 1820s are infused with Greek revolutionary rhetoric, calling attention to the abolitionist movement. So it really has also this dynamic impact on domestic ideas.
Yeah, I did not know about William Lloyd Garrison on that one. Yeah, I can't see him going over there and actually doing any of the fighting.
Yeah, no. And I think he came to that conclusion too.
But yeah, then you bring up a good point, tying in how it was actually the abolition kind of aspect of it. But like reading through the book, it does seem like there is a bit of race and religion-based reasoning for Americans supporting the Greeks, maybe even more so than political ideology, or at least as much. How did issues of race and religion play into so many Americans showing support?
So a number of fascinating things here. So of course, 1820, we have the Missouri Compromise. We have early, rumblings for sectionalism, division between North and South. And the Greek Revolution seems to kind of mend the fence a little bit. It becomes this idea that Northerners and Southerners both resoundingly support. And it seems to be on the basis of a number of ideas. Again, that classical identity, which is very much a part of this emerging national identity of the early 1820s. Also, though, the fact that the Greeks are Christian, although, and I talk more about this in the book, the Greeks are Christian, but they're not the right kind of Christian. They're Orthodox Christians, but that's okay. We'll fix that. Is kind of the overarching discussion there. They send missionaries, etc., to see to that. But race also becomes an interesting factor. So, how Americans knew the Ottoman Empire was largely through their encounters with Barbary pirates and this very popular literary genre known as the captivity tales. These and there's lots and lots of these. Some are fictional stories about white Christians being taken into slavery in the Barbary states. Some of them are factual accounts written by real people, but these were popular, lurid tales that people were familiar with. And so their understanding of the Muslim world, and of course then the Ottoman Empire by extension, is that the Muslim world is the exact opposite of how we see ourselves, which is, we promise democracy, we are the fulfillment of Enlightenment principles, and the Ottoman Empire is the exact opposite. They are everything that is tyrannical. So we then, as an extension of that, it's this idea of white slavery is not okay. And of course, I go into more in the book about how we start to see once again division by the late 1820s, where abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison start saying, so you say you don't support Greek slavery, and yet we have slavery within our own borders. So they start to use that conversation to try and draw attention to the abolitionist movement, which of course is still very much a radical movement.
It almost sounds like that maybe then goes hand in hand with the same time at moving over to slavery being a positive good in a more race-based view of that. I mean, does it seem to fit with kind of going hand in hand with more of a switch by Southerners to be proactively defending slavery as a good and on the race base?
Yeah, we certainly see in the sources defining slavery in the United States in racial terms. And like, for example, and I talk about this in the book, there is an account of the races and how they were perceived at that time. So whiteness, like the perceived as, of course, superior and perfect, is equated to like classical statuary. Like, this is what the ideal human being looks like. In fact, in particular, it's compared to the Apollo Belvedere statue. It's considered to be this perfect example of classical statuary. And so by extension, the Greeks are compared to the Apollo Belvedere. This is why slavery in the Ottoman Empire is not okay, because this is what you're enslaving, this perfect example of humanity. But slaves in the United States, they're not that. So this is different. And so we start to see an argument then where Southerners, that's how they're understanding the question of slavery. Greek slaves are totally different from the slaves in the South, and abolitionists really double down in trying to say, no, that is not an acceptable argument, that they're human beings, right? But it becomes part of the argument.
Wow. And not only with kind of changing mindsets of those, but also I think somewhat changing mindsets of revolutions from the American Revolution, and then how there's debates about various ones happening globally. Does this Greek Revolution, does it fit within typically American views of revolution, or do you think this is kind of unique in how Americans are viewing this one as opposed to other ones like the French Revolution, just a few years prior?
Yeah, so both. Whenever there's news of a revolution, you do see articles being printed in newspapers where Americans are going, yes, the tide is turning towards republics, right? There's particular interest in during the same time period in revolutions happening in South America. Simón Bolívar, for example, is sort of considered to be the South American equivalent of George Washington. And I think Simón Bolívar kind of wanted to be perceived in that light anyway. But even though Simón Bolívar generates a lot of interest in the United States, the Greek Revolution, because of that ancient connection with the classical democracy, et cetera, it seems that resonates even more with Americans, because again, and in our modern standpoint, it doesn't seem to jive, but within the mindset of the 1820s, the ancient world, in terms of the Greeks and the Romans, were very much a part of that American national identity that they were trying to forge at that point.
Yeah, such an interesting period how people, again, self-reflection on their own revolution, and then every other revolution pops up again. It kind of comes back to the surface about what the American Revolution was and how exactly they should view it in terms of the future of the U.S.
Right. And they actually used comparisons to the American Revolution repeatedly. You should support the Greeks because they're the seedbed of ancient democracy, but also because they're just trying to realize the same things that we realized through our own revolution.
And of course, we're in Virginia. You teach in Virginia. In Virginia, because critical, the Virginia dynasty coming to a close from this period now, but with the revolution, so many prominent Virginians. Any Virginians stand out to you when you're doing research about their support or maybe surprising lack of support for the Greek Revolution? So
Thomas Jefferson, of course, was probably one of the first American Philhellenes. He becomes familiar with the ideas of a Greek nation couched in Enlightenment terms while he's in Paris, as I already mentioned. And he writes home to lots of friends, including other Virginians, that the possibility of a Greek nation could be a real possibility. He writes really excitedly about it. In the actual moment of the revolution, I found a lot of archival materials in Alexandria, for example. There was a Greek-inspired literary group that actually completely renames itself into being this Greek Philhellenic group. And they set to work trying to motivate the entire town of Alexandria to mobilize for Washington's birthday. Washington's birthday at this time was almost as important as the 4th of July. And certainly, especially for Virginians, right? So they organize this whole event around Washington's birthday. There's a parade. They get children's groups involved. Everybody's donating money. They gave talks. So that was, I thought that was really cool just to see the community involved. In terms of other localities, I came across all kinds of little towns, including Petersburg, Richmond prints and reprints, tons of articles nationally about what's going on, which suggests that there was this interest throughout Virginia in following the Greek Revolution. Unfortunately, like so many things in the antebellum period, because Virginia, like a lot of the South, they don't have these larger cities like New York, Philadelphia. So they lag behind in having a large Philhellenic group. And in fact, in some archives, I think it was the New York Historical Society, where they actually have thousands of receipts of individuals across the country mailing in donations to the New York Greek Committee. There are receipts from Virginians, and sometimes they were accompanied with letters. And one guy from Stanton in particular wrote, make sure this money gets to the Greeks. It's just terrible that there isn't a larger Philhellenic group here in Virginia, but we're doing our best. So there was a grassroots interest. It's not at the same level as some of the larger Greek committees, of course.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think back. I wish I'd have looked at it when Lafayette was in Leesburg. There's hours of toast basically being done during the celebration. And I'm pretty sure the Greek Revolution gets brought up.
And frankly, when you look at newspapers in the 1820s, you're hard pressed to find a newspaper that doesn't mention the Greek Revolution somewhere. So yeah, I would not be surprised at that at all. Other Southerners, aside from Virginia, like John C. Calhoun, really tried to get the Monroe administration to support the Greek Revolution. Joel Poinsett has a private conversation with John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State at the time. Listen, we really want to support, like Daniel Webster is getting up there on the congressional floor, like, let's do this. And John Quincy Adams is just like, no. I've already sent a secret agent to try and negotiate a trade agreement with the Ottomans. We are not going to support a revolution within their borders because it's going to blow up in my face. So that was a whole other interesting political intrigue surrounding the events.
One of the few things that William Lloyd Garrison and John Calhoun, I guess, can come together on.
That's right. But right, exactly.
Great. Well, this has been super interesting to hear. I think we're going to have a lot more questions to it. And for those watching, put questions on the Facebook post too, and we'll try to answer those for you. But again, the book is The Greek Fire from Cornell Press. And also, I'll put a link to where you can purchase that as well. But it's out now. Maureen, once again, thanks for joining us for this Pour Over History interview. This is a very fascinating look at, a revolution that I think sometimes gets overlooked or maybe not even known by some of our readers during this important time period where the country kind of begins to grow and really figure out its own identity.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
All right, thank you again. And we'll post this on Facebook and our YouTube page and keep following the Loudoun Museum for future programs that we have coming up.